Young Lives is a collaborative study of the Millennium generation. Its design and scale is unique, following the same 12,000 children growing up in 4 countries to identify what can be done to lift children out of poverty. What did we find? Since the beginning of the millennium, Young Lives countries have seen their economies grow. Households are better off and have greater access to services. All the same, inequality is becoming entrenched and some children have been left behind. The impacts of growing up poor are clear. The poorest children experience intersecting disadvantages, including their rural location, ethnicity, and household poverty. Their first years of life are critical. Weak basic services, food insecurity, and household poverty all undermine healthy development, and low maternal education and well-being also matter. Undernourished children arrive at school the least prepared and able to learn, and the poorest have the least access to early learning programs, despite standing to gain the most. Investments in quality and equitable preschool systems pay off for both children and society. Early childhood is foundational, but it's not the only life phase that matters. Some children whose growth was stunted in early life show normal growth later, linked with improved learning. Worryingly, other children have faltered. Services such as school feeding offer a crucial opportunity to sustain children's development. More children are going to school than ever before, with gender parity in enrollment a major achievement. Girls are often staying in school longer than boys, but access doesn't equal learning, which is undermined by harsh disciplinary practices and quality shortcomings. The poorest children generally experience the weakest schooling and face the greatest pressure to juggle education with work. Important measures include making schools safer, prioritizing quality schooling, irrespective of a child's gender or background, and helping relieve competing demands so children can meet their hopes for education. Adolescence is a second window of opportunity, but also a time of great responsibility and risk. Children's economic contributions accelerate during adolescence, even while they strive to remain in school. Gender disparities grow as young people and their families start making choices around intimate relationships, parenthood, and work. Importantly, we found real signs of hope, promise, and policy success. There is important value added in Vietnamese schools, and staying in school protects girls from young marriage. There is also real hope in physical recovery after the earliest years. But to continue to transform lives, access to training, livelihoods, and decent jobs is essential. Young people must be at the heart of inclusive policies to create healthier, more productive, and just societies, and to break the intergenerational transmission of poverty. We're excited to see where they go next.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name's Dr. Cath Porter, and I've got the pleasure and honour of showcasing the work of the Global Young Lives team for the next hour. So I just start off with a little bit of housekeeping, having welcomed you, to note that we're recording this session in case there's anyone wants to watch it who couldn't make it. Throughout the webinar, if you have a question, could you please put it in the Q&A box that you're going to see at the bottom of your screen there. We've got a few of the team prepped and ready to answer any questions that you've got as I'm speaking. We'd also love it if people could introduce themselves in the chat. And if you've got a connection with Young Lives, it's really great to see who's with us today. Also, at a couple of moments during the webinar, we're going to ask you to participate in a poll or two to get your views and opinions. These are going to pop up onto the screen in a pop-up window. You just select the answer and submit it. Don't worry, it's nothing too difficult. So we're going to be joined later by Jaime Saavedra, who's the Global Director of Education Practice at the World Bank Group, and he's going to be sharing his reflections on the findings that we've got and on his take on the value added of longitudinal data such as Young Lives. And then I'm going to come back later and share our plans for the future, which I think are quite exciting. So without any further ado then, I am going to share my screen with you, and I'm going to present a little bit about the background of Young Lives, and I'm going to talk you through our latest findings from our COVID-19 phone survey. It's the 5th in a series that we've got. So, growing with Young Lives. What is Young Lives? I know many of you are long-standing friends of the project and have been our friends for many years, but in case anybody is not familiar with the study, it's actually the longest running study of its kind. We run in the developing world in 4 quite diverse countries: Ethiopia, India, 2 states of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, Peru and Vietnam. And it was set up at the beginning of this millennium in the early 2000s in order to monitor the causes and the consequences of child poverty. And we've been producing research ever since then that feeds into policies at the national and the global level based on our mixed methods longitudinal research. And we've been really, really active. We're very keen that our research is not just sitting on the shelf, it's something that really engages in policy debates, and we really want to try and shift things to improve the lives of young people. And you can see on the slide some examples of influence we've had in the spheres of early learning, education and nutrition, amongst other things. And let me just highlight one of the most recent policy influences, which was when our India country director, Dr. Renu Singh, participated in a task force in collaboration with the National Commission for the Protection of Child Rights in the past couple of years. And she inputted evidence from Young Lives on the consequences of early marriage. And that's led now to an actual policy change in India that the legal age of marriage for young women has gone up to 21 years of age, which is actually in parity with that of young men. So that's something that we've done in a concrete way. And you can find on our website a bunch of different policies that we've influenced. And how have we done that? Well, the study is based on 2 cohorts of children. The main cohort, we call sometimes the children of the millennium. They were born just after the turn of the millennium, within a year of each other. 2,000 children in each of our 4 study countries. We also have an older cohort, 1,000 in each country, and they were born 7 years earlier. And in a way, they can serve as a comparison group because they're the same age as our younger cohort at different points in time. And we've recently produced a piece of research where we've compared the children of the millennium with the older cohort 7 years previous to show the effect of the pandemic. I'm going to come on to lots more about the pandemic as we speak. On top of our, so in terms of our cohort structure, we've then got a bunch of surveys, which are the backbone of our research. We go and visit families, children, young people as they've aged, and we ask them about their lives. Over the past 20 years, we visited them 5 times in person for the large comprehensive quantitative survey, so all 12,000 children. And then we also have more targeted research, which goes into more depth for a few of the children, a subset of children in each country. And we do very in-depth qualitative research where we really talk to them about their lives and their hopes and dreams. We've also got school surveys. We go into the schools where the Young Lives children go, and we surveyed all of the children in their classrooms, and we've got a lot of findings on education. We have several other sub-studies as well, including one of our most recent was on young marriage and parenting, and I've referenced that. So, and the most recent, which I'm going to come to, is the COVID-19 phone surveys in 2020 and 2021. So that's a bunch of data, number crunching research. But I think, you know, what we're able to do is really capture the lives of young people. And you can see here a life map from one of our Ethiopian young women now, Hafde. And you can see how her life looked at the age of 15 to her. She was happy at the age of 3 because she saw a car. Unfortunately, by the time she was age 10, she'd lost both her mother and her father, and she ended up moving in with her grandmother. She did a lot of work to support the family, and she did a lot of housework to try and support her grandmother, but her grandmother beat her. One night she ran away. She's had some great achievements, passing her exams, and at that point she had an ambition to finish university and become a doctor, and then get married at the age of 30. So you can see it's not just about the numbers, it's about really understanding the lives of the children as they grow up and become young people. So all of this in-person research we did, and as we're all painfully aware, the COVID-19 pandemic started in early 2020, and we were forced to postpone our planned field work for our round 6. However, the team was not deterred, and we were determined to contribute by documenting the experience of young people. Now, before I go on to talk a little bit more about that, I'd like to call upon Rachel to put up our first poll and get you to think about how many hours do you think each of our Young Lives participants have spent in the interviews with our enumerators over the past 20 years. Just have a think about that and make a guess. Of course, it's a little bit different for all of them, but just on average, how long do you think? So COVID-19, we pivoted to a phone survey. And as you can see from the chart, we have very different experiences in the Young Lives countries, with Peru being the hardest hit all the way through, and Vietnam being relatively unaffected in 2020, but then catching up, as it were, in 2021. You can see the timing of our phone calls. Now, we managed to raise an amazing 10,000 of our young people, which is around 80% of our original sample. Now, that's really outstanding work by our teams. I take hardly any credit at all for that. It's really the country teams who've done such a good job tracking people down. In Ethiopia, there was around 35% of young people didn't even have a phone of their own. So how could we do that? I'd like to turn to our principal investigator in Ethiopia, Dr. Tassau Waldahana, and get him to tell us a little bit about how could we reach people even without a mobile phone in Ethiopia.
One challenge when designing a phone survey in low and middle income countries is reaching the poorest and the most vulnerable group, who most likely do not own a mobile phone. This was a challenge for a Young Life study conducted in 2020, as 34% of the participants didn't own a mobile phone. We solved this issue and have been able to contact and interview them by using the long-standing relationship that Young Life had with local field guides. These field guides have been cooperating and working together with the Young Life study over the past 20 years by helping our field workers to access households and find them where they are. In the recent COVID-19 phone survey, the field guides were able to go to respondents' household who they know well and give them access to their personal phone to complete the interview. This innovative example really highlights the unique value of long-standing relationship that Young Life has developed over the past 20 years, which finally reduces the phone survey bias that most phone surveys encountered. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Tassau. highlighting there the value, firstly, of the long-standing relationship that Young Lives has with the participants, and the innovation of finding field guides who could find and give a mobile phone to those without a phone. The next challenge we faced was we were trying to collect precise GPS information about where people were, but of course we couldn't go and visit them. So I'd like to now just ask Hong, our policy officer in Vietnam, to explain how we could get a precise geolocation despite not visiting in person.
Collecting GPS data location of respondents has always been very important because it allows us to locate participants more easily and interview them again. In the previous round of data collection, this was done by enumerators, but in recent years, due to the pandemic, we couldn't visit the respondents in person. And so we designed an innovative new way of collecting this data by creating an online survey. So those participants who have access to a smartphone device and internet connection at their home were sent a link to which, after completing some questions, they simply had to click on a button, record location, and this will use the GPS built-in device of the device. This new technique was piloted in the fourth phone survey with a subsample participants, and then was extended across all eligible participants in India, Peru, and Vietnam for the fifth phone survey. So this new data collection method not only demonstrate that it is possible to collect GPS data remotely, but it also cost-effective and relatively easy. With ever-increasing mobile phone access, this innovative way of collecting data offers interesting possibilities for the future of Young Lives, but also for other longitudinal studies.
Thank you, Huang. I think that's really, really important. We've made several innovations that have been useful for us, and that we're also talking to other studies about how they can also use to adapt for their own surveys as well. So turning to our main findings and putting them against the Sustainable Development Goals, which are, as you all know, the main goals that the world has signed up to by 2030. And we thought we would contrast really what we found with some of the SDGs. Over the past 20 years, we have seen an improvement in the standard of living of young people in Young Lives, in the communities, access to services, etc. But what we find now is that the intersecting crises of COVID, climate change, and conflict are really threatening to derail the prospects of this generation. So it's really a call to action from Young Lives. The time to act is now. The focus has been less on young people during the pandemic because they've been less susceptible to the health effects of the crisis. But imagine being a young person right now, trying to begin your adult life, trying to complete your education, secure your first job and build a livelihood, potentially build a family in this difficult time. So we really want to support, and we're asking you to join with us as we do that. So I'm going to take you through a couple of the SDGs and give you our take on what we think the implications of our survey round are. So no poverty, that's the #1 goal of the SDGs, that we're going to end poverty extreme poverty by 2030. Well, actually what we found even between 2020 and 21 is that more families are poor or destitute in 2021. On top of that, we've seen an increase in inequality in that the poorest households and the most vulnerable groups are the ones who are reporting the highest levels of poverty. In terms of hunger, which is of course very related to poverty, again, we've seen actually a worsening, and we found that more families are worried that they're going to run out of food in 2021. And again, it's vulnerable groups who are more likely to run out of food. And we think that, there are many reasons for this, including COVID. We have a particular link with climate in Ethiopia, which links to SDG number 13 on climate action. We've seen that climate crisis is worsening. I was at the COP26 in October talking about protecting girls' education. In this case, severe droughts are really triggering severe hunger. Almost half of our Young Lives respondents in the SNNP region of Ethiopia reported actually running out of food at some point during 2020. So Young Lives' policy call is that we really need to invest in social safety nets that are shock responsive and reach the poorest and most marginalized communities so that we can help build resilience. Global Goal 4 on quality education. Now, during the crisis, as we know, most countries implemented lockdowns and schools were closed in all of our 4 countries. In Peru and Vietnam, the schools are only just reopening. And when school is closed, of course, students without internet access are unable to connect. There are some TV and radio shows, but internet is really the way that the best way of connecting. Students need not just access to internet, but also access to a device to get onto the internet. And we really found that those without such access were much less likely to engage with their studies and were much more likely to drop out of their courses. So we found that there was a digital divide that really widened during the pandemic. So again, Young Lives has a policy call to reopen schools and universities, which is almost now happening, and really supporting the most disadvantaged of young people to get back to their classes. That's got to be the top priority, improving the quality of education, and in general, addressing the digital divide that we've uncovered. Otherwise, educational inequalities are only going to widen. In terms of good health and well-being, you can see from this graphic that only 3% of our Ethiopian cohort had had one vaccine by the time the year ended in 2021. So it goes without saying that there's vaccine inequality here. Young Lives supports the global call to action to address vaccine inequality, both between and within countries. Even in the countries where we've had better access to vaccines, we find that the richer are more likely to get the vaccine. Another aspect of well-being that Young Lives has really monitored during the crisis has been mental health. We've really found high rates of anxiety and depression, especially in Peru, all the way through the pandemic. In Vietnam, we found lower levels of anxiety and rates of anxiety and depression, but in our final call in the end of 2021, there was an increase that was quite dramatic relative to a low base as the wave of COVID-19 hit Vietnam. So this is an issue that we really take seriously, and we really want to support research into how we can expand mental health care, and we call on countries to invest in accessible mental health care, integrate mental health care into existing services, and really think about what will work for young people in different contexts. Goal 5, gender equality. Well, there's been gender equality runs as a thread throughout many of our findings in the different areas, education, health, etc. I'd like to highlight our findings on domestic violence. Prior to the pandemic, young women were more likely to have experienced domestic violence. Now, what we found in our phone survey in 2020 was that physical domestic violence did increase significantly during the pandemic. And in fact, it increased for both men and women, though women from a higher base. And in Peru, we saw almost 2.5 people in 10 had reported an increase, though for women, as I say, it was more than men. Now, you might think, well, did they just ask people over the phone about domestic violence? That seems a little bit insensitive. Of course, we couldn't do that. It wouldn't have been appropriate. So how did we ask the unaskable? I'm going to ask our PI in Peru, Dr. Alan Sanchez, to show how we managed to do that in an innovative approach.
To measure domestic violence during the lockdowns in Peru, we use a strategy called list randomization, which is used to elicit truthful responses about questions on sensitive topics. Basically, at some point during the interview, we randomly split the sample into two groups. In the control group, participants were read 4 statements that may or not apply to them, none about violence. And in the treatment group, the other participants were read the same 4 statements and an additional statement about domestic violence during the lockdown. They didn't need to tell which statements apply to them specifically, but only how many of them apply to them in both groups. By calculating the difference in the averages of the two groups, we were able to calculate the increase in violence during the lockdown without actually asking the question. We found that in the young life sample in Peru, 8% of participants experienced more of violence during the lockdown, and that went up to 24% for those that had been victims of violence in the past.
Thank you very much, Alan. So that was one way we could try to measure what is very, very difficult to measure. And we have again talked to other people about how they could adapt our ways of doing things to do their own measurement of sensitive topics. So I think that's been really important. Let me turn now to decent work, which of course is also related to gender equality, as you can see from the graph here. So what we found is, again, the lockdowns have caused significant job loss for young people. There is evidence that young people have bounced back, but when we look into it a little bit deeper, we find 2 important concerns about this. The first is that there's definitely a widening gender gap in employment. So whilst young men's levels of employment have bounced back almost to pre-pandemic levels, women are not returning to the workplace. It's been called the she session in other studies. We definitely found the same. We find also that young men are being pushed into work and being pushed out of education, which is another concern. The other thing that we are concerned about is that the quality of jobs may be deteriorating. So our policy recommendation here is to really focus on what are the barriers that young women are facing in order to get back to employment that they may have lost. This goal, peace, justice, and strong institutions, it really speaks to our concern in Ethiopia. We were in fact unable to conduct our survey during 2021 in the Tigray region of Ethiopia due to the conflict which broke out in November 2020, which is still ongoing. And so it's very concerning that we haven't even been able to get in touch with our participants in Tigray, and neither have people been able to get in touch with their families. So we're very, very concerned about, even whether people have survived. If they have, what have they experienced and what have they seen? But even in neighboring regions where we were able to survey, we have found that there's already been employment effects and there have been mental health effects. So we're very, very concerned about the situation, and our ambition is to be part of the recovery effort in the best case scenario, that as the recovery effort will begin, that we're going to be right there supporting that, researching what will work to support young people, many of whom will have had a very traumatic experience. So moving now to inequalities. Again, this has been a thread really throughout the presentation, that those who were already disadvantaged, the gaps have widened. So the pandemic has really exacerbated existing inequalities. I talked about vulnerable groups in terms of hunger and poverty. I talked about gender in terms of the employment gaps. And we've seen that those who have no internet, who are the worst off groups, have been less likely to be able to stay on with their education. So we're very, very concerned about the most vulnerable. Again, it's very hard to reach the most vulnerable. And I'd like to now share with you some insights from our country director, Dr. Renu Singh, from India, on how we were able to reach young people with disabilities during the pandemic to try and gather their experiences.
It's always challenging to undertake research studies with people with disabilities and ensure their full participation and inclusion. During the pandemic, this posed even greater challenges, and therefore we decided to use community guides. These community guides went to and identified the homes of each person with disabilities, established rapport, and then provided them with tablets through which our researchers, both special educators and qualitative researchers who were sitting far away due to safety protocols, could then conduct the interviews. Of course, we had to also adapt the questionnaires to ensure, for example, that the hearing impaired could use sign language, those with intellectual impairment were given easier questions. But all in all, I think these methodologies proved a huge learning for all of us.
Thank you to Renu. So that's been a rather quick tour of our findings from our headline reports, which you can find on our website. There's lots more information there, including our latest peer-reviewed research, our latest blogs, and more information on Young Lives in general. So thank you for listening. I'd now like to invite Dr. Jaime Saavedra to join me and to give his comments on the presentation. Now, I'm sure many of you know him very well, but just to give you a tiny bit of context, Jaime is the lead of the Education Global Practice at the World Bank, and he's also previously served as Minister of Education in Peru. He has many, many peer-reviewed publications, groundbreaking work in the areas of poverty reduction and inequality, as well as in education, working with international organizations and think tanks. So we're very excited to have you here with us, Jaime, and I'll give the floor to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Cath. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. Just want to confirm that you can hear me well.
Yes, we can.
Super, thank you very much. So look, I wanted to make a couple of comments related to what you have presented, but also to Young Lives in general. I mean, I was lucky to be involved in the with the Young Lives project since it was conceived in the early 2000s, so some time ago. I remember having been involved in the conceptualization of how to apply the best research methods that we can on one hand, and second, how can one design a project that will be sustained for many, many years and be able to follow people and through their lives. And in that regard, Young Lives, I think it has been already extremely successful. Young Lives as a longitudinal study has had incredibly low attrition rates, something that is always a huge challenge in this type of study. After 20 years, I mean, the probabilities of losing people, not be able to follow them, given migration and given, I mean, given different contexts that are happening in the different countries, sometimes you see attrition that are extremely high, and you end up with 1/3 or 1/4 of your original sample. In the case of Young Lives, after 20 years, I mean, we're still reaching about 80% of the original children, which is extremely remarkable. And also considering that 4 or 5 of the last data collections have happened remotely over the phone during very difficult circumstances, which is to a certain extent also a testament to the commitment of the field workers and supervisors, many of whom have been involved in Young Lives for this last 20 years of innovation, of applying very innovative methods. Now, this study that has kept relevant for over 2 decades already. And in addition to the quality of the methods, the research agenda has been adapted, not only as children have grown up, but also in response to changing times and changing in research questions and in policy debates. So we have gone from the impact of early nutrition, the role of malnutrition in subsequent learning, to be able to study the potential of physical recovery and improved skills development later, after having problems later in the adolescence, the role of education and school for the development of foundational cognitive and also non-cognitive skills. What's the impact of staying in school over the possibility of early marriage and childbearing? Recently, more the labor market analysis and trying to understand in which way young people can transit to decent work and entrepreneurship. And now more recently, Young Lives have been extremely useful, providing almost real-time evidence on the impacts of this pandemic. Even more in real time, I mean, the impacts of what's happening with the ongoing conflict in Ethiopia. And in the case of the pandemic, I mean, what are the impacts of increased food insecurity, the worsening of mental health, as it was mentioned, the issues of domestic violence, and obviously something that we care about and we're looking at a lot of detail in the bank is a disruption in education and learning, which as all these issues are absolutely critical for for informing the current policy, the policy debates. I wanted to mention also that compared to many other recent phone surveys during a pandemic, including phone surveys that have been done by the World Bank, there's the unique power of Young Lives that one can link what we're seeing today, right, the impacts that we're seeing today, to characteristics of people today, but also to what has happened to those people early in life, right? So that gives us a much richer picture about in which way digital divide before might have an impact today. And also, I mean, as we have said, as we has been mentioning, what are conditions, I mean, previous conditions of people that might have an impact on domestic violence. So in general, I mean, Young Lives have been an extremely powerful tool. And I just want to close saying that the impacts of a study like this that goes a long time on policy, right, on policy design, it's much larger, right, than in many other cases, because, you know, the impact on policy depends on a political window of opportunity to open, right? I mean, you can finish a study today, but maybe the authorities are not ready today to absorb, right, the consequences of that, or the implications of that study. And that window of opportunity, that political window of opportunity, might open later, right, in which there's the space, right, to make changes in policy. And it was relatively easy for me to see that in the case of Peru, when Cuna Más, right, which is an early childhood development program, right, was strengthened, right, because of results, previous results, right, of young lives, right. So actually, the possibility of researchers of being there, right, and having analysis that will be ready to be used by policymakers when those political windows of opportunity appear is extremely useful. So I think looking forward, there's huge potential for combining these 20 years of unique data in order to continue analyzing, I mean, different aspects on labor markets and education, on domestic violence, etc., in a way that very few studies allow us to do, particularly in these countries. I mean, how are we going to be able to combat the impacts of COVID, issues of climate changes, of conflict, right? This is a unique database that's really difficult to find elsewhere. So I encourage you to continue, encourage you in the coming rounds to understand the links between childhood learning trajectories and outcomes as young adults, and to understand better what's the long-term impacts of the pandemic, and linking that to conditions previously in life. So really, congratulations for all the work so far. There's a lot of that we could continue researching with this database. And also, I just wanted to comment, just to close, the quality of the research. And we have heard many examples of very innovative, very innovative tricks in order to try to get answers of those difficult to ask questions, and usually the sometimes we make mistakes even in terms of how we ask a question, right? And we have seen several examples of very clever, right, research methods in order to be able to disentangle complex issues. So congratulations for all the work so far. I really look forward more and more continuous results from the Young Lives team in the different countries. Thank you very much, Catherine.
Thank you so much, Jaime. Those are really, really kind words, and really thank you for all your support. And we'll definitely take on board your suggestions about really trying to map out from the early learning trajectories right through as we continue our research. So thanks very much for your comments and for being with us today. And thank you to the rest of the audience for participating in the poll with us. So the actual answer is approximately, anyway, 32 hours that our participants have spent with our enumerators. Now, of course, it could be more or less depending on how many sections they have to answer, etc. So I think those of you who were between 20 and 35, I think you've got it approximately right. 21% of you, because I know a lot of you like statistics, 21% of you got that correct in the poll. And now I'd like to have another poll. We've heard from Jaime about what he thinks our priorities are. Again, I know we have a very esteemed group of people in our audience, so we'd like to get a slightly more serious poll about what you think the most important issue is facing young people. We know that everything is important, but what do you see as the biggest challenge that young people are going to be facing in coming years? And I'm now going to take you through some more discussion about what we would like to be doing next as Young Lives over the coming few years, our hopes, dreams and ambitions. And a call to action for our supporters to collaborate with us and to partner with us. So what next for the children of the millennium? So currently, we know we've done a whole load of research that you can see on our website. We've followed the trajectories of these two cohorts right from early years, preschool, all the way through to employment. And our current focus areas, especially the Young Lives at Work programme funded by FCDO, the UK government, is a big focus on education and skills development and on employment, especially on decent work. Now, looking forward, we're a very ambitious bunch of people. We're a team that really wants to stay relevant to the changing lives of our cohorts. There are two aspects to this, I think. First is, they're growing up. The issues that they face are just different now from when they were babies, of course. They're transitioning to adulthood. But as I've already said, they're transitioning at a point where really this is an unprecedented situation. People like me have never had to grow up in a global pandemic, start my life in a global pandemic, including we've got climate change and conflict for some people as well. So we really want to respond to this 21st century challenge we're calling COVID, climate and conflict. We think this is a real backdrop to the situation, and we're ambitious to collect more and richer data and do more research so that we can then engage with policymakers and really support young people as they go through their lives. So we'd like to enhance our work streams and incorporate health and well-being. Obviously, there's physical health, but I've already talked quite a lot about mental health as one of the issues that's really come up for young people as an area of concern. And then we'd also like to think more about family lives. We have a bunch of research questions that we'd like to answer, thinking about how young people are balancing their home and work lives, their responsibilities to the older generation, their parents and older relatives. They've also having families of their own. How are they balancing paid work with unpaid obligations in the household, supporting family members? So Young Lives has always been a really integrated, multidisciplinary program where we really try to think holistically about the lives of children and now young people as they grow up. We all know from our own lives that you don't just make an employment decision, which job to take or where to move to in a vacuum, only about do my skills match with that job. You also consider your personal life, and young people are really trying to manage these things. So we'd like to see young people's lives in a whole and expand our agenda out to be much more holistic. On top of that, we'd really like to explore much more in depth gender and the intersecting inequalities that I've highlighted from our phone survey, and all amongst this backdrop of COVID, climate and conflict. The new issues that young people are facing, how are they responding to that? What can support them as they go through their early adult lives in this? So in order to do that, as I've said, the backbone of our research is our primary data collection. And you can see here in red at the far right of our cohort diagram, I've added here what we're ambitious to achieve over the coming few years, starting with in-person data collection in 2023, our round 7 data collection, the large quantitative survey. And we would also like to go back to the field for our in-depth qualitative research as well. We'd like to go back in 2027. It's really important at this point. We have all this information on our children through their lives. We've captured the short-term effect of the pandemic. We now need to look at the medium and long-term effects of the pandemic. We know that children have been born into the pandemic, and we would like to set up a new cohort called the COVID-19 cohort, or the children of the pandemic, in order to follow the lives of children born into this situation. So those are our ambitions for our field work. And with that, we'd like to expand our research agenda. So it's our call to action. We're seeking like-minded partners in order to partner with us over the coming 5 years. We need to get funding to help us to continue our work on topics that you yourself may be passionate about, including health, mental health, skills development, and all the other issues I've mentioned. We'd really like to start a conversation with people who are interested in what we're doing, including following the children of the children, and really being able to understand both the long-term effect of early life shocks and how these intersect with the current vulnerabilities that young people are facing. How does that intersect with inequality? So really making Young Lives be at the forefront of what's happening in the world now, building on this huge body of evidence that we've already got. So that is a look to the future, and I would like to thank all of our funders who are either with us now, people who fund us in the past, and who are funding us at present. Thank you to all of you for your support, and we'd really like to keep going and continue the conversation with you. So that's the end of the presentation. And I'd like to thank you for your time. Please reach out to us if you've got any questions about Young Lives. You can find us on our website, LinkedIn, Facebook, etc. So let me come back to the second poll that we had. And it seems that the majority, 38%, have said that employment and access to decent jobs should be the priority. So that's a top priority for this audience, followed by health and mental health, 1 in 4 of you. 1 in 5 of you said environment and climate change, and education, 14%. That could be reflecting, of course, the age of the cohorts. Some of them are actually, some of our Ethiopian cohort are still in primary education. So it's still relevant, but it's true that many of them have already completed their education. So thank you for voting in the poll, and it's been really useful. I hope that our team have answered any questions as they've come up. And I think that that's been going on. I've not really been looking at it, but I'll look back in the chat and find out. But I'm sure we've had an interesting debate. Thank you to the audience for coming. And really, let me just reflect that I am here, I'm the face of Young Lives as the director, but I'm really representing our country teams in Peru, India, Ethiopia, and Vietnam, our country directors who really partner with us and lead all of the work in the countries to engage with policy and make sure all our work is relevant. We also have our research teams and our enumerators and field supervisors who really do the hard work in tracking down our participants and finding them and asking them in a sensitive way all of these questions so that we can then take their testimony and bring it to the world and engage with policy. So thank you to everybody who's helped fund us. Thank you to the whole Global Young Lives team who I know are connected. And thank you to Rachel Bevan for doing all the technical support on this. Thanks to Jaime for speaking to our agenda and giving us all the advice for the future. Thank you, Jaime. And really thanks to the whole audience for coming along. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. And here you can see our recent headlines. You can find out more on social media or on our website. Thanks, everyone, and goodbye.